Okay, so back to Lincoln's assassination. One of the most eerie incidents in American history happens around Lincoln's assassination, and we know this is true because he told the story to his cabinet, and so a number of cabinet members talked about it. And Lincoln said this was a couple of weeks before his assassination. And Lincoln was a guy that he actually visited mystics when he was in the White House. He constantly talked about his dreams. He wasn't a traditionally religious person, although he does become more religious as the war goes on. Um, but he definitely has a spiritual side, or maybe a mystical side, might be a better way to put it. And so he told his cabinet that he'd had this dream, and this is a couple of weeks before he's killed, that he was at the White House working late, which he normally did, and he fell asleep on a couch, and then he woke up, and what woke him up were this sounds of mourning, people crying, and in the dream, Lincoln said he got up and he walked around the White House, and he was looking for the location of where people were that were crying, and why they were crying. And so he walks into one of the large ballrooms in the White House, and there's a casket on a there's a big casket there, and a number of people surround this casket, and they're all weeping uncontrollably. And Lincoln says to one of the soldiers, there were soldiers guarding the casket, what's happened? Why are people crying? And the soldier said, well, haven't you heard? The president's been assassinated. Very, very eerie story. Lincoln has a dream that predicts his own demise. It's not well known, though, but we think that there was another assassination attempt on Lincoln earlier in the Civil War. He used to stay at a place called the Soldiers' Home, which was in kind of a high point of Washington, D.C. He'd stay there, especially in the summer, because it caught a little bit more of a breeze than the White House. And so he'd ride through the streets of Washington. And in one incident that wasn't much talked about, someone put a bullet through Lincoln's hat. He was riding with a guard. And there's speculation that it might have been John Wilkes Booth, but it seems like someone had taken a shot at Lincoln even before the assassination. So what happens is this. John Wilkes Booth was a very famous actor. He came from an acting family, very well known at the time, and Shakespearean, but all kinds of melodrama in addition. Wilkes Booth was a strong Southern sympathizer, and of course, he was really horrified by what was happening, the Lee surrender. Joe Johnston, Sherman accepts the surrender of the other Confederate army in Carolina very quickly after Lee surrenders, and so basically what you have is a collapse of the South, of Confederate armies, which basically that means the defeat of the Confederacy. So John Wilkes Booth was very, very upset about this. And he thought that if he killed Lincoln, he might be able to reignite the war. It's not like the guy was thinking straight, but he did have a bit of a game plan. The other thing that's very important to remember about Lincoln's assassination, it was a conspiracy. We talk about, especially with the Kennedy assassination, there's all this speculation that it was a conspiracy, although I don't think it was. I think Oswald acted alone, but that's neither here nor there. It's just my opinion. But the point is about Lincoln, to go back to this course, is that there was a conspiracy. John Wilkes Booth did plot with a number of men, and what he was trying to do was not only was Lincoln supposed to be killed that night, Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's uh, vice president, he was supposed to be killed that night, and William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, very, very powerful man, he was supposed to be killed that night as well. Now, the guy that was supposed to kill Johnson chickened out at the last second, but Seward actually almost died. One of John Wilkes Booth's conspirators got into Seward's room. Seward had been in a carriage accident, and so he was bedridden. And the assassination, the assassin rather came to the door and said, "I'm here with news from the president. I need to see Secretary of State Seward." Security wasn't really tight back in those days. He gets into the room and he stabs Seward, and the only thing that saves Seward's life is his son fights off the assassin, and he suffers cuts as well. So what John Wilkes Booth was planning was a decapitation of the Union government with this assassination plot. Very famously, Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater to see a play, My American Cousin. John Wilkes Booth had the full run of this theater because, of course, he was a famous actor. He'd been there all the time. There been performances there, so he could come and go as he pleased. Lincoln actually invited Grant and Grant's wife Julia to join him, but Julia Grant didn't like Mary Todd Lincoln at all, and she had her husband beg off. And so Lincoln took a more junior officer. So they go see the cousin, this American Cousin, which was kind of a lame comedy, but Lincoln loved to see plays. He especially loved Shakespeare. King Lear was his favorite. So he goes in. His bodyguard apparently was drunk, leaves the door unlocked. John Wilkes Booth goes in and shoots Lincoln in the head. He jumps onto the stage. He fractures his ankle in doing so, and then he escapes. Lincoln is taken next door, and then he dies in the middle of the night because of the wounds to his head. John Wilkes Booth is captured. He's not captured, rather, he's cornered a week or so later, and he's killed by Union soldiers. And a number of his conspirators, his co-conspirators, were later executed. So that's where I'm going to leave you now. Lincoln's been assassinated. There's a new president, Andrew Johnson. The Civil War in the United States, anyway, is over. Lee has surrendered. Confederate troops have surrendered to William Sherman. And now we're going to go into the period of Reconstruction, in which for a brief time African Americans gain some basic rights, which they will quickly lose. So we go into a much more, I think, complicated and tragic period of American history, what one historian, Eric Foner, has called an unfinished revolution.